Hi, my name is Jordan Lamberty, and I'm going to be talking about cultural expression that you can see through the works of masters in the arts. So I'm going to be focusing on these three artists you see here. The first, Celia Cruz, a salsa singer. The second, Diego Rivera, a muralist. And third, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a writer. I chose these three because I think that they have a common core value of cultural expression, which is shown in their works. So if we start with Celia Cruz, when you listen to her music, you have to consider her native country to really fully understand it. So I'll give you some background on it. She was born in 1925 in Havana, Cuba, and grew up there. She started her singing career and was a hit sensation and even earned a spot in Cuba's most famous orchestra, La Sonora Matancera. She was touring in Mexico in 1960 during the Cuban Revolution, and she decided not to return to Cuba. Instead, she resided in the US. This made Fidel Castro extremely mad, and he actually ended up banning her so she could not return to her homeland, and she never got to go back before she died. Considering this about Cruz, when we look at one of her songs, Guantanamera, we should really be looking at the meaning behind her words. This song is commonly recorded by many artists. It's about a Guantanamo woman who a man falls in love with, but ends up breaking his heart. It's based actually on a poem that was originally written by a Cuban poet called Jose Marti. I think that Cruz sings this song, even though it's sang by multiple others. I think she sings it because she knows that it's culturally relevant to her because it is written by a Cuban about Cuban people. So I think it's important for her to express part of her culture by singing this song. You could also consider her famous battle cry of Azúcar to be another form of cultural expression. It is said that this call that she makes during songs to the crowd stems from history of her homeland and its people. It may reference the African slaves who worked on the sugar plantations at one time in Cuba. The fact that she's honoring and remembering these people who were taken as slaves in nearly every single performance or show shows how much she values her Cuban culture. She left a really lasting effect on Latin music. She was one of the first female Latin singers who spoke out for things that she believed in, such as an end to racism, and she really paved a way for women to follow. Now I will move on to the muralist Diego Rivera. He was an artist who commonly portrayed the history of his Mexican culture. He was born in Guanajuato City, Mexico in 1886. He was an amazing painter who was often commissioned to do murals. He preferred to do frescoes. His works were often seen on normal public walls on buildings so that any person would be able to see his work. This, I believe, was a way that made it easier for him to share all of his messages with other people. His main message was typically that Mexico's culture should be celebrated and remembered. In many paintings, such as this one we are seeing now, Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park, he features multiple things in this painting that shows his value for his expression for his Mexican culture. For example, if you look in the middle of this screen here, or this picture here, you'll see what I zoomed in on as a skeleton. Now, when I see this, I interpret it as recognition of the Mexican tradition called Dia de los Muertos, which is the day when in Mexico the living honor the dead, and skeletons that look like this one here are found everywhere. Now, when we're looking back at the main mural, if you look over here to the right, I also zoomed in here. but you see what looks like a fight between native people and a police officer, as well as a man that is being trampled by a horse while he has a gun also in his face. So I believe that Diego incorporated this portion of the mural because he wanted to draw attention to the destruction that came along with the discovery of their land. People turned the natives' worlds upside down and killed so many of them. And in this one painting, there are so many spots where Rivera sticks cultural stories, such as that one. He does this in his paintings, I believe, because he has a core value that the culture of his people should be shared and their stories should still be told today. The second mural by him that I'm going to talk about is arguably his most famous one, the Detroit Industry mural. This was somewhat a controversial mural at first when it was presented because it has workers portrayed of multiple races. There are whites, blacks, browns, there are all kinds working together, which was unheard of at this time. I believe that Rivera decided to paint these people working together knowing that it would be controversial because he wanted to talk about cultures and that there really should not be any differences, and what he believed in, that his culturally belief was that all races are equal. So he made this bold statement. Diego represented culture of Detroit in these murals, as well as the industry at the Ford plant. In this group of 4 murals that he had in this building, he included things such as agriculture and modern medicine. I believe he added these in to show that the culture has been changing, but it's still important to understand and appreciate what the culture was before now. So the last master of art that I will be talking about is Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was a writer who was born in 1927 in Aracataca, Colombia. He says that almost all of his stories are from real-life experience or from short stories or tales that were told to him orally by his grandfather. One in particular of his stories is 100 Years of Solitude. This was the book that you could say made him famous. It's about a family in Macondo, which is an isolated town. The inhabitants of this town are beginning to be driven by negative things such as lust and greed as they have more modern accessibility. Some say this is supposed to be a small-scale portrayal of the history of Latin America. While it is a realistic novel, he used what was called magical realism in his stories. Magical realism is when there are fantastical or mythical elements in an otherwise realistic fiction. So this would stem back to his upbringing. With his grandpa telling him so many stories, he had the great imagination where he could put things in that didn't quite belong, but to him, it was right. This was how he grew up, and this oral tradition was part of Aracataca's culture. When he tells stories today and writes his novels, he says that are true to him. He shares more of his own culture that he grew up with the rest of the world. I believe that he wanted to share his culture, and that is why he went on to write, although he had studied to be a lawyer. His influence on writing was very big. He was one of the first to use magical realism and actually turn it into something that wasn't brushed off or stuck in a genre of just fiction. It was still a realistic fiction with these unrealistic elements. While there are many, many masters in the arts, these 3, Celia Cruz, Diego Rivera, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, all do much of their work for the ability to share their culture with the rest of the world. Thank you.